Hi, my name is Ale, and in this video I will be showing you how we can use MapKit in SwiftUI to find a route and directions between two places. At the time of filming this video, MapKit is still in beta for SwiftUI and lacks many features available in UIKit. To solve this issue, we're going to use a uiview representable. A uiview representable essentially lets us wrap a UIKit view so that we can integrate it into a SwiftUI app. We're going to start by creating a uiview representable wrapper around a mapview. Let's first import MapKit. Now let's add a struct for our mapview. Struct mapview uiview representable. We have to provide the type of view that our uiview representable will create. So we can define a type alias uiview type, and this is just gonna be an mapview. Now, to conform to the uiview representable protocol, we also have to implement different functions. One of these functions is called make uiview, func make uiview, and this function provides the view that we want to display using this uiview representable. So we have to first create an mapview. Let mapview equal to mapview and return it. Another function we have to implement is the update uiview function, func update uiview, and for this tutorial we're just gonna leave it empty. Before we start customizing our map, let's define the initial UI of our app. So in our content view struct, we're going to get rid of the text and we're going to add a vertical stack, vStack. Inside this vStack, we're first going to add a map view. And under the map, we're going to have a button that a user can press to see directions. Button with an action, which we will leave empty for now. And in the label, we're going to have a text that says show directions. And we're also going to add some padding around our button. So let's run our app and see if we can actually see a map. Great, so we have a map, and we also have a button that will eventually show directions between two places. Now let's go back to our code and start customizing our mapview. When we first create our map view, we want to center it on a specific region. In this tutorial, I'm going to center it in New York City. And to do that, I'm going to create an coordinate region. Let region equal to coordinate region. An coordinate region needs a center and a span. For the center, we have to create a location coordinate 2D, CL location coordinate 2D that needs a latitude and a longitude. The latitude of New York is 40.71 and the longitude is -74. And for the span, we have to create an coordinate span with a latitude delta and longitude delta, and I'm going to use 0.5 for both of these values. Great, so now that we have our region, we can set the region of our map by doing mapview dot set region animated true. So now if we run our app, the map should be centered in New York City. Perfect. Now that we have our map centered in New York, we're going to go back to our code and add the necessary implementation to get directions between two places. In this video, I'm going to use two static places because I think being able to search for places deserves its own tutorial. So for this video, I'm going to use New York City and Boston. So let's first define a place mark for New York City. I'm going to call this P1. Let P1 be equals to an MK place mark. And an MK place mark needs a coordinate object. So we're going to use New York City. We can copy and paste the one that we defined earlier. So this is New York City. And we're also going to add the place mark for Boston. Let P2 be equals to an MK place mark. CL location coordinate 2D. The latitude of Boston is 42.36 and the longitude is negative 71.05. So now that we have the two places that we want to get directions between, we can create an MK directions request. Let request be equal to MK directions dot request. We need to provide a source and a destination. Request dot source, and this is provided in the form of an MK map item, which needs a place mark, so the source is New York or P1. Now we need to provide the destination, which is an MK map item with the place mark for Boston or P2. And we're going to define the transport type. In this case, I'm going to add the automobile transport type. Request dot transport type is equal to dot automobile. Great. So now that we have our request object, we need to create a directions object and then calculate the directions. So let's define a directions object. Let directions be equal to MK directions. And this directions object needs a request that we have just defined. Request. And now we're going to call a function called calculate, which will give us a response or an error if something goes wrong when calculating the directions. So what we're going to do is call directions dot calculate, and the completion handler will give us a response or an error. Response error in, and the response object will have a list of routes that were calculated. So if we're able to get one of these routes, then everything's great. So let's try to get this route. Guard let route be equal to response dot routes dot first. Otherwise, we just want to return. There's nothing we can really do. If we're able to get the route between New York City and Boston, then we want to add some annotations to our map to mark these two places. So we can call mapview dot add annotations, and this just takes in a list of MK annotation. So here we can provide P1 and P2. And after this, we want to add an overlay to our map. This overlay will draw the line that shows the route between New York City and Boston. So we can call mapview.add overlay, and this overlay will be the route polyline object. So polyline is the line that will be drawn between these two places. Now, after this, what we want to do as well is set the region that will be visible on our map. So previously we set New York City as the region that's visible, but now we want to make sure that you can see both New York City and Boston, and then the route between the two. So we're going to call mapview.set visible maprect. And for this mkmaprect, we can provide route.polyline.bounding maprect. And we're going to set animated to true. I'm also going to add some padding around this rectangle, and we can do this by providing the edge padding parameter. And this is a UI edge insets object, and I'm going to provide a value of 20 for every side. Perfect. So now when our map is created, we're first going to set the visible region to New York. Then we're going to make a request, and we're going to try to get the directions between New York and Boston. If we're able to get a route from this directions request, then we're going to update our map to show the route. So let's go ahead and run our app and see how it looks. So we see New York City centered on the map when we initially run it. Then we see that our map changes its view to show both New York City and Boston, but we don't actually see any line drawn on the map to show the route between these two places. What we have to do here is provide a delegate to our map that will be in charge of actually drawing this line. So we're going to go back to our code and provide this delegate. So let's go back to xcode, and inside our mapView structure, we're going to define a class that will act as a coordinator. So let's call it class mapView coordinator, which will be of type NSObject, and will also conform to the MK mapView delegate. Inside this class, we're gonna implement one function inside the mkmapview delegate that will allow us to draw the route between New York City and Boston. This function is called func mapview renderer4. So let's look it up. Renderer4 overlay. So what we do here is we create a renderer that will render whatever overlay we need in our map. So in this case, we want to create a polyline in our map. So for this, we're going to create a renderer. Let renderer equal to mk polyline renderer. And the overlay parameter is just the overlay passed to the function. We're going to give a stroke color to our renderer, and I'm gonna use blue. So this will draw a blue line for the route. I'm also gonna provide it a line width with a value of 5. And finally, we can just return this renderer. So now that we have our mapView coordinator class, what we have to do is let our mapView know that its coordinator will be a mapView coordinator. To do this, we have to add a function called makeCoordinator, func makeCoordinator, whose return value will be a mapView coordinator, and all we have to do here is return an instance of the coordinator. mapView coordinator. Great. And so this coordinator will act as the mkMapView's delegate. So we have to tell our mapView who its delegate is going to be. So we have to add a delegate definition inside our makeUIView function. mapview.delegate is equal to context.coordinator. So let's run our app again and see if now we can actually see the polyline showing the route between New York City and Boston. Great, so as you can see, we now have our map and we see a marker for both New York City and Boston, and we also see the route between these two places. If we press the Show Directions button, nothing happens, and that's because we haven't yet added any action to our button. So what we're gonna do is add an action so that whenever this button is tapped, we show a sheet showing the directions between these two places. So let's go back to our code. And first, one thing we have to do is define a directions property inside our map view. And this is gonna be a binding at binding var directions, and this is gonna be of type array of string. So whenever a map view is created, we need to provide a binding of an array of string. So let's go back to our content view and create a state variable to hold these directions at state private var directions, which is of type array of string, and initially this array will be empty, and now we can provide that as the directions binding inside our map view. We need to use the $sign and then directions. What this binding will let us do is whenever our directions are calculated, we can populate this array with the directions, and so now this directions array will hold the directions to get from one place to another, and we can show it inside a sheet that will be visible whenever this button is tapped. So we have to go back to our map view and make sure that we add the directions to the array. So inside the calculate method, what we're going to do is get the directions from our route object. And this is done by getting first the steps, and then from each step we're gonna get the instructions. So here what we're going to do is self.directions is equal to route.steps, and for each step we want to get the instructions, so we can call the map function and get the steps instructions. And we also want to make sure that these instructions aren't empty, so we can use a filter function and filter in anything that is not an empty string. Not dot is empty. So now this directions array will hold the directions between New York City and Boston, and our main view in our app will get these directions as well. So what we have to do now is show the sheet that includes these directions. So one thing we're going to do initially in our app is also make sure that our button is not enabled unless we know that we already have some directions to show to the user. To do this, we can use the disabled function, and our button will be disabled as long as our directions are empty. So we can call directions.isEmpty. Now to actually show the sheet with these directions, we're going to need a state variable that determines whether these directions are visible at state private var show directions, and initially this will be false. the action of our button will just consist of toggling the value of this variable. So we can call self.showDirections.toggle. And now what we have to do is actually present this sheet whenever showDirections is true. So under our vstack, we can call the sheet function. And we're going to use the isPresented sheet. And this will depend on the value of showDirections, so we can provide it as a binding. We can get rid of this onDismiss. And for the content, we're going to have a vertical stack. Inside this stack, we're going to add a title that first will say directions, text, directions, and I'm going to do some styling. So font will be large title, and I'm going to make it bold, and I'm also going to add some padding around it. After my text, I'm going to add a divider, which will have a color of blue, so we can use the background modifier, color.blue. And finally, after my divider, I'm going to have a list that will show the actual directions. So let's create a list object. Inside this list, we're going to add a for each. And here we're going to use an index, so it's going to first start out from 0 all the way to the count of the directions array. Self.directions.count, and this is exclusive. And the ID will just be the index itself. Self. For each of these indices, I'm going to add a text object that will show the direction contained at that index. So we're going to add a text, which will just show self.directions at index I. And I'm also going to add some padding around my text. Padding. So let's run our app again and see how it looks. When our directions are calculated, we should now be able to press the Show Directions button and see a sheet that shows the instructions to get from one place to the other. So we see our map centered in New York, then we see our directions, we see the polyline showing the route between these two places, and let's press our button. As you can see, we now have some instructions to get from one place to the other. And we can also dismiss the sheet and go back to our map, and we still see this route between our two places. Great. So that's all I wanted to show you in this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new. If you want to learn more about iOS development, make sure to subscribe to my channel, as I'll be posting new videos very soon.